The scissors were already open when Ezra looked up. He didn't move fast enough. He never did. Mr. Calloway's hand came down. Not violent, not dramatic. Just decided. Like Ezra wasn't a person worth asking. Like his hair was an inconvenience that belonged to everyone in that room except him. The first snip hit the floor before Ezra could even reach for his notepad. Cold. That's the only word for it. Not the scissors. The room. 23 students sat in that classroom. 23 pairs of eyes. And not one of them said a word. Not one hand went up. Not one chair scraped back. Just this thick, awful quiet that somehow felt worse than if they'd all laughed at once. Ezra's hands gripped the edge of his desk so hard his knuckles went pale. He couldn't yell. He couldn't say stop. He couldn't do anything that a person with a voice might have done in that moment. He just sat there while Mr. Calloway worked the scissors like Ezra was a hedge that had grown past the property line. Hi viewers. Have you ever been in a room full of people and felt completely invisible? Like no one was willing to speak up for you? Drop your experience in the comments. I want to hear it. The hair fell in soft, dark curls. One by one. Each one landing on the linoleum like a small, quiet loss. Ezra watched it happen from somewhere above himself. That's what shock does. It lifts you out of your own body and makes you a spectator of your own humiliation. Mr. Calloway said something. Ezra saw his lips move. The other students laughed. A short, nervous sound, the kind that people make when they don't know what else to do. Or maybe they did know. Maybe they just didn't care enough to do anything different. What hurt most wasn't the scissors. It was that no one stopped him. Not the aide by the door. Not the student council rep in the front row. Not Mrs. Okafor who passed the open classroom door mid-snip and kept walking. Nobody. Ezra was mute, and somewhere along the way the world had decided that meant he was also easy. He reached down slowly, picked up a single curl from the floor, held it in his fist under the desk where no one could see. That was all he had left to do. The bell rang, sharp and bright and completely indifferent to everything that had just happened. Ezra reached for his bag, started to push back from his desk. Relief was already forming in his chest, small, shaky. But there. Just get to the hallway. Just get out. But Mr. Calloway's hand landed flat on the desk in front of him. He didn't leave his chair. We're not done yet. The hallway sounds bled through the classroom walls. Lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking, voices stacking on top of each other. And in the middle of all of it, Ezra Malone sat completely still. Mr. Calloway finished whatever he was saying. Ezra didn't catch most of it. When a person can't speak, they learn early to read a room by feel, not words. And what this room felt like was a man convincing himself he hadn't done anything wrong. Ezra nodded twice. That was enough to make Calloway satisfied. The teacher finally stepped back. And then Ezra was alone. He stood up slowly. Every movement felt heavier than it should have. He found the small broom kept near the supply closet. He'd noticed it weeks ago, the way quiet people notice things, and he swept his own hair off the floor, curl by curl, piece by piece, into the trash like it was nothing, because that's what the room had already decided it was. The custodial staff had a protocol for that kind of thing. Drop a pencil, someone picks it up. Spill a drink, someone brings a mop. But a child's dignity cut and scattered across a linoleum floor? Apparently that one was on the child. He was still sweeping when Mrs. Okafor came back in. She looked at the broom, then at Ezra, then at the trash can. The room looks fine now, she said. Procedural, distant, the voice of someone filing a form in their head. You can head to your next period. Ezra looked at her. He didn't reach for his notepad. She left. That's how it worked. That's always how it worked. Not cruelty, just process. The system didn't need to be mean to grind a person down. It just needed to keep moving and pretend the grinding wasn't happening. He was almost to the door when he heard the voice. Small. Curious. Cutting right through everything. Why did he do that to you? Ezra stopped. He turned. She was young. Too young to be in this hallway during this period, maybe 7, maybe 8. Wide brown eyes under 2 uneven pigtails. a visitor's badge clipped to her sweater that said guest in oversized red letters. She was standing 3 feet away, staring up at him with the kind of direct attention that adults had long since learned to hide. Her name, Ezra would learn later, was Nyla. She wasn't asking to be polite. She genuinely did not understand. "Your hair," she said, and she pointed at the trash can. "He put it in there." Ezra exhaled slowly. He looked at her for a long moment, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small notepad he carried everywhere. He thought about what to write, about how to explain to a child what an adult had just done without making the world sound like a place she should be afraid of yet. He wrote, "I don't know." She read it, tilted her head. "That doesn't make sense," she said. Ezra almost smiled, because she was right. It didn't make sense. And the fact that a 7-year-old could see that so clearly, so immediately, while 23 older students and 3 staff members had processed it as normal, said something about the world that Ezra didn't have enough pages in his notepad to fully explain. Nyla looked at the uneven patches on the side of his head. The jagged, hasty cut that Calloway had left behind like a signature. She reached up, carefully, like she was asking with her hand before her mouth, and touched the edge of the uneven patch. "I like it," she said very seriously. "It looks brave." Ezra stared at her. That was the first time someone looked at him like he mattered. Not like a case. Not like a situation. Not like a form to be filed or a complication to be managed. Just like a person who had been through something. And was still standing. He swallowed hard. Nyla's guardian appeared at the end of the hallway. A woman in a gray coat who called her name in a voice that expected immediate obedience. Nyla turned, then looked back once. "I'll see you again," she said, with the absolute certainty that only very small children and very powerful people tend to have. Ezra stood in the empty hallway long after she disappeared. He didn't know who she was. Didn't know why she was here or who had brought her or what a child that age was doing in a secondary academy during school hours without a class to go to. He wouldn't find out for another 18 hours. By then, someone very far away, someone Nyla called Uncle, had already watched the security footage 3 times. The administrator's office smelled like recycled air and bad coffee. Ezra sat across from Vice Principal DeWitt with his hands folded in his lap and his notepad on the desk between them, and he watched the man not quite look at him. DeWitt was a careful man, the kind who measured every word before it left his mouth, not because he cared about honesty but because he cared about liability. "We've spoken to Mr. Calloway," DeWitt said. He explained the situation. Ezra waited. "There's a grooming compliance policy." DeWitt folded his hands. "Length standards. Hygiene standards. The policy exists for..." Ezra picked up the pen, wrote slowly and turned the notepad around. "I know the policy. I was within the guidelines." A pause. DeWitt glanced at the notepad, then back at his desk. "There may have been a miscommunication." Ezra wrote again. "There was no miscommunication. I was sitting down and he used scissors." DeWitt cleared his throat, shifted papers that didn't need shifting. "We'll look into the matter internally. These things take time." Ezra stared at him. He had been in enough rooms like this one to know what "look into it internally" meant. It meant nothing was going to happen. It meant a form would be filled and a box would be checked, and in 3 weeks everyone in this building would act like it never occurred at all. He took his notepad back, stood up. DeWitt said something else. Ezra didn't bother turning around to read his lips. The hallway was quieter now. Most students were in class. Ezra walked slowly, his bag over one shoulder, and found the corner near the east stairwell where no one usually went during second period. He sat down on the bottom step. He didn't cry. He'd stopped doing that around the 3rd placement. Not because the feelings stopped, they never stopped, but because crying without a sound, with no one to hear you, starts to feel like a conversation with a wall. He heard a small shoe scuff the floor. Nyla appeared from around the corner like she'd been looking for him specifically. She probably had. She sat down next to him without asking. Not rude, just direct. The way children are before the world teaches them to ask permission before taking up space. She looked at his hair again. "It grew on me," she said. nodding once like she was confirming something she'd already decided. Ezra looked at her sideways. She pulled a small notebook from her sweater pocket, a purple one with a star on the cover, and held it out. "We can share," she said. "I don't mind." He looked at the notebook, then at her. She was still there. At 11 in the morning in an administrative hallway during a school day she clearly wasn't enrolled in. A child with a visitor's badge and perfect posture and no visible reason to still be here was offering to share her purple star notebook with him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Ezra wrote in his own notepad, "Why are you still here?" She read it. "My uncles had a meeting. It's taking a long time." She said the word uncles the way people say obviously, like it explained everything. It explained nothing. "They're important," she added. "Everyone says that." Ezra wrote, "What kind of important?" She tilted her head. "The kind that makes people stand up when they walk in a room." She paused. "I don't really like that. It makes me nervous when everyone stands up." An administrator passed the end of the hallway. She glanced at Nyla, then at Ezra, then kept moving. Not concern. Just visual inventory. Just checking a box. Nyla watched her go, then looked back at Ezra with calm, measured eyes that were much older than her face. "She didn't ask if you were okay," Nyla said. "It was a statement, not an accusation. Just an observation the way a child makes one, clean and direct, without the social training to dress it up as something politer." Ezra shook his head. "My uncles would have asked," she said. And then, quieter, "They always ask." He didn't know what to do with that. They sat together in silence for a few minutes. It was the most comfortable Ezra had been in a building in a long time. Not because anything had changed, but because someone was simply choosing to sit beside him without needing anything from him. Nyla eventually said she had to go find her escort. She stood up, brushed off her skirt, and looked at him one last time. "I told my Uncle Zion about you," she said, matter-of-factly. "Before the meeting." Ezra went still. "He asked what your name was." She tilted her head. "I didn't know, so I described you instead." She walked away down the hallway, purple notebook tucked under her arm. Ezra didn't move for a long time. Somewhere in this building, 3 men had arrived for a meeting that had nothing to do with him. And somewhere in that meeting, one of them had quietly asked a question about a mute boy with uneven hair, and then, according to a source Ezra still didn't fully understand, had excused himself early. That evening, in a room Ezra had never seen, 3 identical faces leaned over a security monitor. The footage was from the classroom. Second period. That morning, no one spoke for a while. Then one of them, the one Nyla called Uncle Zion, said a name quietly. Ezra's name. Said it like he had been waiting to confirm it. Said it like he already knew it. And Ezra had never told it to anyone in this building. The summons didn't come with guards. That was the first thing Ezra noticed. No administrator with her clipped, professional voice. No security staff with a hand gesture that was technically a request but functionally in order. Just a quiet knock on the door of his study room, the small one off the East Hall where solo students were sent to work. And a young woman in a navy blazer who said simply, "Someone would like to speak with you. You're not in trouble." She said that last part like she knew he would need to hear it twice. He needed to hear it twice. The walk across campus was short. 8 minutes. Through 2 corridors, past the gym, into the administrative wing that students didn't usually have business in. The woman knocked at a door marked simply Conference B and pushed it open without waiting. The room was not what Ezra expected. No long tables. No fluorescent humming overhead. Someone had opened the blinds, so afternoon light sat low and warm against the far wall. There were 3 chairs, regular chairs, not the hard plastic kind, arranged close together. A glass of water sat on the table near one of them, untouched. 2 men stood near the window. One sat. They were the same man. That was Ezra's first, disorienting thought. He looked between the 3 of them and his brain took half a second to catch up. Triplets his mind supplied. Same face, same height, same stillness that a person has when they're used to holding a room without trying. The one who sat stood up the moment Ezra walked in. and then did something Ezra had not expected from any adult in this building, in any building in recent memory. He pulled a chair forward, positioned it so they would be sitting at the same level, and then he knelt beside it. Not all the way, not like a dramatic gesture, just low, eye level, the way you do when a child is scared and you want them to feel like you don't own the room. "My name is Zion Vale," he said. His voice was steady, quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't need to fill space because the space already belongs to it. "These are my brothers Ezekiel and Elian." The other two nodded once each. No hands extended. Ezra realized later that they had taken one look at the tension in his shoulders and decided not to crowd him. Zion gestured to the chair. Ezra sat. He had his notepad already out. He held it in his lap, pen ready. Old habit. Zion glanced at it, then back at Ezra's face. "I don't need you to write anything you're not ready to write." He paused. "I asked for this meeting because I watched what happened to you this morning." Ezra's hand tightened around the pen. "I'm not here to ask you how you're doing," Zion said. "I already know how you're doing. I'm here because what I watched on that footage is not something that should have happened. And I wanted you to hear that from a person, in a room, not in a form." Ezra looked at him. No folder. No intake paperwork. No pen pointed at a signature line. Just a man sitting close to the floor so his eyes were level with Ezra's and saying something that shouldn't have been as rare as it was. One of the brothers, Elian, the one with the slight lean against the windowsill, spoke next. Carefully. "We also asked the admin for your name," Elian said. "They told us they didn't have the authority to share that without cause." He paused. "So we're asking you directly." Ezra looked down at his notepad. Wrote slowly. "You already know it." A beat. Zion's expression shifted. Not surprise, but something more layered than that. He glanced briefly at his brothers. "We do," he said. "We have a connection to this institution. It gave us access we didn't ask for." Another pause. "But I wanted you to choose to tell us. There's a difference." Ezra studied him. There was a difference. That was a thing only certain kinds of people understood. That knowing something about a person and having that person choose to share it were not the same transaction. He wrote, "Ezra," then turned the notepad around. Zion looked at it. Something moved across his face that wasn't authority or analysis. It was the look a person gets when they have been carrying a question for a long time and the answer finally arrives. "Thank you," he said simply. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Ezra wrote another line and turned the notepad around again. "Am I in trouble?" Zion looked at those 4 words for a moment. Then he looked up. "No," he said. "You were hurt." Ezra exhaled slowly. He hadn't known he was holding his breath. The afternoon light shifted against the wall. One of the brothers poured a second glass of water and set it near Ezra without comment. Ezra didn't pick it up right away. But he noticed. Zion leaned forward slightly. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And you don't have to answer today." He paused. A careful pause, the kind that means what follows matters. "Do you know where you came from?" Ezra went very still. The question sat in the room like something alive. "Do you know where you came from?" Ezra held his pen over the notepad. Didn't write anything. Just held it there, like the act of pressing it to paper would make the answer real in a way he wasn't ready for. Zion didn't push. Didn't fill the silence with something easier. He just stayed exactly where he was, low level, waiting. Ezra finally wrote, "State placement. Since I was 4. 7 homes." He turned it around. The 3 brothers read it. Something passed between them. Not words, just the particular kind of shared look that people who have known each other a long time exchange when something lands harder than they expected. Elian turned slightly toward the window. Ezekiel, who had been the quietest of the 3, closed his eyes for just one moment. Zion kept his face steady, but his jaw did a thing. Ezra watched all of it. He had learned early how to read a room by small movements. A shift of the shoulder, a controlled breath, the speed at which someone's expression reset. What he read now was not pity. Not the particular softness people got when they wanted to feel good about feeling bad for you. This was something else. Something older. He wrote again. I know what temporary feels like. I'm not asking for anything. Zion looked at those words for a long moment. I know you're not, he said quietly. That's not why I brought it up. You told him your hair was long because someone once told you it mattered, Elian said from the window, not turning around. Ezra went still. He had no memory of writing that. Then he remembered. Nyla. She had asked him earlier, in that careful child way of hers, and he had written it in her purple notebook. She had told them. She tells us everything, Ezekiel said, and the corner of his mouth moved just slightly. Not unkindly. She just thinks information should go where it can help. Ezra looked down at the table. He wrote, She's good. She is. Zion agreed. She is also, for the record, the reason we extended our meeting by 2 hours this afternoon. A beat. She came to find us, Elian said. Mid-meeting, which she is technically not supposed to do. She walked in, said. He paused, like he was deciding whether to quote her exactly, then decided he was. She said, Uncle Zion, the boy with the brave hair is still sad and you need to go talk to him. Then she walked back out. Ezra stared at his notepad. He didn't know how to hold that. The idea that a child had walked into a room of important people mid-conversation and said his name, called him the boy with the brave hair, and that the people in that room had stopped what they were doing because she asked them to. He wrote, She called it brave? She said you looked like someone who had been through something and kept going, Zion said. In her words, brave hair. The light in the room had shifted. Softer now. Late afternoon pressing flat against the wall. Ezra turned to a new page. He wrote carefully. I've been undocumented in every system I've ever been in. No permanent record. No stable placement. I'm probably not what you think I am. He held it up. Zion read it. Then he said something that Ezra had not heard from an adult in a very long time. Maybe never in this particular combination. I didn't come for your paperwork. I came because something wrong was done to you in front of a room full of people and no one moved. He leaned slightly forward. That's enough. Ezra looked at him. Hard. The way you look at something when you're trying to find the catch. The condition, the asterisk, the moment where the kindness turns into currency and you're expected to pay something back. He didn't find it. That was the most disorienting thing. He wrote, Why? Zion looked at the word. Then, carefully, because someone should have. The door opened. Nyla came in without knocking, which clearly surprised the woman in the navy blazer who had escorted her. Less so the 3 men in the room. She looked at Ezra, looked at the glass of water near his hand, looked at the notepad, and then came directly to stand beside his chair. She did not ask permission. She took his hand. Not dramatically, just took it, held it with both of hers the way a child holds something they have decided belongs to them and will not be argued with. He's family, she said, to the room in general with complete finality. No one corrected her. Ezra looked down at her hands around his. Felt something shift in his chest. Not mended, nothing as clean as that, but shifted, like a door that had been stuck for years moving on its hinge. Zion looked at Ezra across the quiet room. If you stay, he said carefully, life will change. I won't tell you it won't be complicated. I won't tell you it will be easy. A pause. But I want you to have the choice. Ezra looked at Nyla's hands, at Zion's face, at the open door and the hallway beyond it. He thought about 7 homes. About silence in a room of 23. About hair on a linoleum floor and an administrator who saw the broom and said the room looks fine. He thought about a child who had walked into a meeting of important people and said his name like it mattered. He reached for his notepad. He looked at the blank page for a long moment. He did not write anything. Not yet, because before he could answer, before he could let himself believe it enough to write it down. The woman in the navy blazer appeared in the doorway again. Her expression had shifted. Something procedural. Something she needed to say that she clearly did not want to say in front of Ezra. She looked at Zion. There's been a development, she said carefully. From the district office. Zion's posture didn't change, but his eyes did. Regarding, he said. She glanced at Ezra, then back. Regarding this meeting. The word liability carries a specific weight when you overhear it being used to describe yourself. Ezra heard it through a wall. He hadn't meant to be in that hallway. After the meeting with the Vale brothers, the woman in the navy blazer had walked him toward a side corridor to wait while Zion handled whatever the district office had sent. She'd pointed to a bench near the water fountain. Said she'd be back in 5 minutes. She wasn't back in 5 minutes. So Ezra waited. And while he waited, 2 voices carried through the gap at the bottom of a nearby door. He didn't catch every word. He caught enough. Exposure for the institution. Oversight complications if the Vale family gets involved at this level. The boy is undocumented in 3 systems. That's a liability, not a placement. Liability, not a name, not a child. A liability. Ezra sat very still on that bench. He pressed the back of his head against the wall, stared at the ceiling, counted the fluorescent panels. 1, 2, 3. He had been a liability before. In the Odom house, he was a liability because he couldn't call for help if something went wrong. In the Brentwood group home, a liability because his silence made the other residents uneasy. In the Mackey placement, a liability because the family had decided a mute child required specialized care they hadn't signed up for. Liability was a word that meant, this will cost someone something and we would prefer it didn't. He reached for his bag. His hands found the zipper before his brain had fully made the decision. Because this was the thing about Ezra Malone, he had learned to read exits before he learned to read people. He knew where the side doors were in every building he'd been in. He knew which staff members did rounds and at what time. He knew how to leave a place quietly, without fuss, without anyone having to make a speech about why it wasn't working out. She looked at his face. She sat down next to him without saying a word, which was unusual for her. Nyla, in Ezra's limited but intense experience of her, always had something to say. She was quiet for 10 full seconds. Then, you heard them. Not a question. Ezra looked at her. She folded her hands in her lap, stared at the floor across from them. A 7-year-old processing a situation that most adults in this building were handling worse than she was. They say things like that when they're scared, she said. Steady. Factual. The voice of someone who had grown up around powerful rooms and learned to decode them early. It doesn't mean it's true. It means they're trying to decide if something costs too much to do the right way. Ezra looked at her for a long moment. He wrote, "How do you know that?" She glanced at the notepad. Uncle Elian explained it to me once. When I asked him why people sometimes say mean things about other people before they even meet them. A pause. He said fear makes people put price tags on things that don't have prices. Ezra looked at that sentence for a long moment. He wrote slowly, "They'll send me away when the attention fades. Someone told me that once." He didn't say who. A boy from his second-to-last placement. Older. Had been through enough cycles of institutional optimism to know how most of them ended. Delivered flatly, without cruelty. They'll send you away when the attention fades. They always do. The quiet ones go first. Nyla read it. "Who told you that?" she said. Ezra shook his head. She looked at his bag. The half-open zipper. "You were going to leave," she said. He didn't deny it. She reached over and, very deliberately, zipped his bag closed. "Don't," she said simply. That was all. Not a speech. Not a promise she couldn't keep. Not an argument or a persuasion. Just the word, clear and direct, from a child who had decided he was worth the ask. Ezra sat there. The door down the hall opened. He could hear Zion's voice now, low, firm, the kind of controlled that means something underneath it is not controlled at all. The district office representative's voice, higher and defensive. He couldn't make out words from here. What he could hear, underneath all of it, was that Zion Vale was not backing down. He sat on that bench a while longer. He did not pick up his bag. But later that night, in the quiet of the temporary room they'd assigned him pending review, he pulled out his notepad and wrote 4 words at the top of a blank page. Then he stared at them. Then he closed the notepad. Because he wasn't ready. Not yet. And when the morning came, the room he'd been placed in was different. Quieter, without the hard fluorescent overhead light, with a small window that looked out at something green instead of a parking lot. And he understood, without anyone saying it, that someone had made a phone call. He just didn't know yet what that phone call had cost. Zion Vale made one call that night. Not to the school board. Not to the press. Not to anyone who would make a spectacle of what happened to Ezra Malone in that classroom. He called the district's oversight office directly. Gave them a case number they hadn't expected him to have. Asked 3 specific questions about grooming compliance enforcement policy that the person on the other end of the phone was clearly not prepared to answer. Told them he expected a written response within 48 hours. That was it. No announcement. No public statement. No footage shared. Just a question put in writing that would require an answer. Ezra didn't know any of this when he walked into the hallway the next morning. What he knew was that Mr. Calloway was not in his classroom. A substitute sat at the front desk. Young. Slightly uncertain. The kind who hadn't been told exactly why they were there. Just that they were. Ezra stopped at the doorway and looked at the empty desk at the front of the room for a long moment. He didn't feel what he expected to feel. He expected relief. Maybe satisfaction. What people describe when a wrong gets corrected and the air around you changes temperature. What he actually felt was quieter than that. Not better. Not healed. Just one step removed from something that had been too close. He sat down. The substitute called attendance. Got to Ezra's name, paused, looked at the file note that said nonverbal, written communication, and gave a small nod like she'd seen this before and was not going to make it into a moment. Ezra appreciated that more than he could write in a margin. That afternoon, Zion came to the campus again. This time without the formal arrangement of Conference B. He asked one of the admin staff if there was a quiet outdoor space available and took Ezra there instead. A corner of the campus that had a couple of trees and a stone bench and absolutely no one else in it at 2:30 on a Tuesday. He sat. Ezra sat across from him. The teacher has been reassigned, Zion said, pending a full policy review. He won't be in a classroom with students while that's ongoing. Ezra wrote. Reassigned where? Administrative role. Off campus. Zion paused. I want you to hear the reasoning behind that decision, because I think you deserve to understand it. Ezra held his pen. I asked the oversight office to investigate the policy, Zion said. Not the man. The policy, because a policy that allows an adult to physically alter a student's appearance without written consent is a structural failure. It doesn't matter who used it. It needs to change so no one else can use it the same way. He looked at Ezra steadily. The teacher will face a review. That's real. But the goal was never to ruin one person. The goal was to make sure this building, and every building under the same policy, can't do this to another child. Ezra read that, sat with it. He wrote, most people would want him fired publicly. Yes, Zion said. Most people would. Ezra looked up, waiting. What do you want? Zion asked. That was the question. Laid flat on the stone bench between them like something real and heavy. Ezra thought about the classroom, the scissors, the silence. He thought about the 23 students who hadn't moved and the administrator who had said the room looks fine and the system that had moved him through 7 homes because the paperwork never quite lined up. He wrote slowly, I don't want him ruined. I want this never to happen again. Zion read it. He didn't react immediately, just looked at those words for a long, still moment. Okay, he said finally. Then that's what we're building. The trees moved. A slow afternoon wind. Ezra turned to a new page. He wrote, you could have made this loud. Why didn't you? Zion looked at the question. Then simply, because loud would have been about me. This is about you. Ezra looked at that. He didn't write anything back. He didn't need to. They sat in the yard until the light started to change. Neither of them filled the silence with anything it didn't need. It was, Ezra realized later, the most honest 2 hours he had spent with an adult in his entire life. On the walk back inside, Nyla found them in the corridor. She had apparently been waiting at the corner for an indeterminate amount of time. because she fell into step beside Ezra like she'd been there all along. "Did you fix it?" she said to Zion. "We started," Zion said. She considered that, accepted it. "Good," she said. Then, to Ezra in a smaller voice, "I didn't let them move your bag from the room this morning." Ezra looked at her. "Someone from admin wanted to log it as unclaimed property," she said. "I told them it was claimed." A pause. "By me." Ezra stopped walking. She kept going, 3 steps ahead, then looked back. "Are you coming?" she said. He followed her. But just before they turned the corner back into the main building, he heard something behind him. A voice, low, coming from the direction of the admin corridor. He turned. Nobody there, but the words were clear. "This isn't over." He didn't know the voice, couldn't place it. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he kept walking. That was the thing about warnings. They only worked if you were alone when you heard them. The assembly was not announced the way assemblies usually were. No intercom notice. No flyer on the bulletin board. No student government president explaining the format in advance. What happened was this. At 9:15 on a Thursday morning, every class in the building was asked to move to the main hall. Quietly, no explanation given. Ezra heard about it from Nyla, who had apparently been briefed. Not completely, but enough, by Elian the night before. She met him at the east stairwell entrance and stood next to him as the students filed in. "You don't have to stand at the front," she said quietly. "Uncle Zion said you don't have to do anything you don't want to do today." Ezra nodded. He stood near the back of the hall. Nyla stood beside him, a visiting child alongside a secondary student in the back row. Slightly unusual, but nobody said anything. Because the 3 men who had walked in at the front of the hall had a way of making strange things feel like exactly where they were supposed to be. The hall went quiet fast. That's what real authority does. It doesn't need to announce itself. Zion stood at the front. Ezekiel and Elian flanked him 1 step back. Not for decoration, for weight. Zion didn't use a podium. He spoke standing in the open space, facing the room. "This is not a punishment assembly," he said. His voice carried without effort. "I want to say that clearly before anything else, because the way these things usually work is that someone is made an example of, and everyone leaves feeling like they watched something happen to someone else." A pause. "That's not the goal today." The room was very still. "What happened in this building last week was a failure of care," he said. "Not one person's failure. The failure of a system, a policy, a culture, a set of assumptions about which students are easy to overlook and why." He looked out across the hall. "The student who was harmed is known to some of you. He is known to me. He did not ask to be discussed today. He did not ask for this assembly. I am holding it because the people who work in this building, staff and students both, deserve to understand what went wrong and what will change." A low sound moved through the room. Not talking, just the collective shift of several hundred people adjusting to something they hadn't expected. "A grooming compliance policy was used as a weapon," Zion said. "That policy is now under full review. No student in this building will be subject to physical modification of their appearance by a staff member without written consent and guardian notification. That is now the rule. It should have always been the rule." He paused. "The student affected by last week's incident is under our family's protection. That is not a legal declaration. It is a personal one. And I make it in this room, in front of this community, because quiet protection is sometimes not enough. That matters." Pause on that. Ezra stood at the back of the hall. He had imagined, sometimes, what it would feel like to be named in a room. To have 100 eyes turned toward you. To be the subject of something public and sudden and loud. He had never wanted it. He still didn't want it. But Zion hadn't named him, hadn't pointed, hadn't made him stand up or step forward or perform his own survival for an audience. He had named the failure. That was different. The room's reaction was not clean. Some faces were moved. Some were resistant, the particular flatness of people who don't like being told they should have done something differently. A few students in the middle rows looked directly at the back wall, which is where you look when you're trying not to look at a specific person and doing a bad job of it. Ezra watched them all. He felt strange. Like his body was one temperature and the room was another, and the gap between them was something he didn't have a word for. Nyla pressed her shoulder against his arm. Not a hug. Not comfort in the performed sense. Just wait. Presence. I am here. Look at Uncle Elian, she whispered. Ezra looked. Elian, standing one step behind Zion, was looking directly at Ezra across the length of the hall. Not for show. Not a signal to anyone else in the room. Just looking. The same way Nyla had looked at him on that first day in the hallway, with the scissor sound still fresh. Like he was a person. Like that was enough. Ezra exhaled. It felt like something leaving his chest that had been there a long time. The assembly ended without applause. Zion didn't invite it. He said simply, "The office is open today for any student or staff member who wants to discuss institutional concerns. That invitation is ongoing." And walked out. The room started moving. Students pressed past Ezra in the back row shuffle. Some looked at him. Some didn't. A girl with her hair in long box braids. Someone he'd seen in the study hall twice. Never spoken to. Paused beside him for half a second and said, "That was right," and kept walking before he could respond. He stood there until most of the room had cleared. Then Nyla said, "Someone is behind you." He turned. A person he didn't recognize, older student, maybe 17, tall, with the particular expression of someone delivering a message they'd been told to deliver in person, was standing 2 feet away. He said, "Someone in the admin office wants to see the Vale brothers. Alone." He looked at Ezra. Looked at Nyla. "And it's about him." Nyla's chin went up. The older student held her gaze for a moment, then looked away first. He turned and left. Ezra looked at Nyla. She was already looking at him. "This isn't the end," she said quietly. That wasn't comfort. That was a warning. From a 7-year-old who had been paying closer attention to this building than anyone had noticed. And she was right. The garden was the kind of place that shouldn't have existed on a campus like this. Small. Half hidden behind the East Building's maintenance wing. Someone had planted it years ago and either forgotten about it or chosen not to advertise it. For raised beds with herbs that had gone slightly wild, a stone path barely wide enough for 2 people walking close, and a bench that faced a wall covered in dark ivy. Zion had found it the second day. He didn't explain how. He brought Ezra here that evening, after the admin meeting that Ezra hadn't been allowed into and hadn't asked to attend. They sat on the bench. The light was going down soft and orange over the top of the ivy wall. Nyla had fallen asleep on the ride over. Apparently the day had used everything she had, and Elian had carried her inside. So it was just the 2 of them and the sound of something moving in the herb beds. Zion said, "The district wants to transfer you." He said it directly. No build-up. No softening. Ezra was glad for that. He wrote, "To where?" "A group facility in Marlow County. 3 hours from here." A pause. "The paperwork cites your undocumented status across multiple placement records as a reason for centralizing oversight." Ezra looked at the ivy wall. He had been to Marlow County. Not the facility, but the county. 4th placement. Winter. He remembered the color of the sky there. A flat gray that never lifted. And the sound of a radiator that rattled every night and nobody fixed. He wrote, "When? They want a response by end of week." He wrote, "And what do you want?" Zion was quiet for a moment. "I want to be very clear with you about something," he said. "Because I've thought about how to say this carefully, and I'm not sure careful is what you need right now." Ezra looked at him. "We can challenge the transfer. There's legal standing. Procedural failures in your case history that make the district's position weaker than they're presenting it. Ezekiel has already identified 3 documentation gaps that a family attorney can use to file a formal objection." He paused. "But none of that happens without your agreement. I will not make a legal move on your behalf without your consent." Ezra held his pen. "And beyond the legal question," Zion continued, "there is a different question, which is whether you want to stay." He looked at the ivy. "Not because we need you to, Not because it helps our position, because this should be your choice. The garden was quiet. A small wind moved through the herbs. Ezra thought about 7 homes. He thought about how he had learned to gauge warmth not by what people said but by what they did when nobody was watching. He thought about Zion kneeling down to eye level in a conference room when he didn't have to. He thought about Elian looking across a hall full of people like Ezra was the only fixed point in it. He thought about Ezekiel quietly pouring a glass of water and setting it nearby without making it a statement. He thought about Nyla pressing her shoulder against his arm. Just wait. Just presence. He wrote slowly. I've spent most of my life trying not to need anything from anyone. Because needing things from people who weren't going to stay was worse than not having the things. He paused. Then a new line. You're saying you'll stay. Zion read it. Didn't look away. Yes, he said. Ezra wrote. How do I know that's true? You don't, Zion said. Not yet. He turned slightly on the bench. But you know it the way you know anything that's true slowly. By watching what happens over time. He paused. I can't give you certainty. Nobody can. What I can give you is a reason to stay long enough to find out. Ezra looked at that. He turned to a new page. Wrote. What happens to me if I stay and it doesn't work? Then you leave, Zion said. On your terms. Not the district's. Not a transfer form. You leave because you chose to. A long pause. You can leave any time, Zion said. That's not me pushing you out the door. That's me telling you the door isn't locked. There's a difference. Ezra put the pen down. He looked at his hands. At the garden. At the last of the orange light dying soft behind the ivy. He thought about the packed bag on the bench. The zipper Nyla had closed with 2 deliberate hands. He picked the pen back up. He wrote one word. Okay. Zion looked at it. He didn't celebrate. Didn't fill the moment with something larger than it needed to be. Just nodded once, the way you nod when something important and quiet has happened and you want it to stay that way. They sat in the garden a while longer. Eventually the door opened and Nyla appeared, sleep-rumpled and slightly disoriented, looking for them. She found the bench and climbed up between them without asking. Just settled in, leaned her head against Ezra's shoulder, and closed her eyes again. Neither of them moved her. The garden held all 3 of them in the last of the evening light. It was the most ordinary thing, and somehow that was exactly the point. Tomorrow, Zion said softly after a while, will be harder. Ezra looked at the ivy wall. He believed that. He stayed anyway. The hair came back uneven. That was the first thing anyone noticed, months later, when Ezra Malone walked back into a classroom that had a different feel to it. New seating, different light, a policy binder on the teacher's desk that hadn't been there before. The left side grew faster than the right. Nobody told him to fix it. Nobody sent a note home. Nobody reached for scissors. He wore it the way Nyla said, like something brave. The policy review Zion had set in motion took 11 weeks. Not fast. Not dramatic. The kind of change that happens in rooms nobody films, a committee, a revised manual, a training requirement, a consent form added to every student intake packet. It didn't make the news. It didn't need to. It just became the rule. Ezra read the final policy document on a Tuesday afternoon, alone in the quiet room off the East Hall that he had come to think of as his. Someone had put a small plant on the windowsill at some point. He didn't ask who. He read every page. Then he set it down and looked out the window at something green. The Marlow County transfer had been formally withdrawn 6 weeks earlier. Ezekiel's documentation challenge had taken less time than expected, 3 procedural failures in Ezra's placement history, one of which dated back to his second home and had never been corrected. The district's legal team quietly recommended withdrawal rather than a contested hearing. Ezra had signed his name on the response form. That was the first time in recent memory that his signature had done something that helped him instead of something that moved him somewhere he hadn't chosen. He was still learning what that felt like. The academic year continued. Not smoothly, nobody promised smooth. There were days that were too loud even without sound. Days when the hallways felt narrow and the faces felt too many and he needed the east stairwell corner and 30 minutes of nobody talking at him. There were days when Nyla was not on campus because her schedule rotated, and those days had a particular texture to them, not bad, just different. Like something that had been holding a shape relaxed slightly. He started keeping a second notepad. The first one was for communication, practical things. The second one was for other things. Things that didn't fit in the margins of practical conversations. He didn't share it with anyone. Not yet. Maybe eventually. Zion visited every 2 weeks. Sometimes more. He didn't always have something specific to discuss. Sometimes they just sat in the garden when the weather allowed it, and Ezra wrote things that weren't questions and Zion read them and didn't always respond, and that was fine. That was actually specifically fine. Ezra was learning the difference between silence that was empty and silence that was full. That was important. On a morning in late spring, he walked into his first period class and sat down and pulled out his books and the girl with the long box braids. Her name was Amara Whitfield. He knew that now. Leaned across the aisle and said, "Your hair looks good today." He looked at her. She shrugged. "Just saying." He wrote in the margin of his notebook, "Thank you." She read it, nodded, turned back to her work. That was all. It was such a small thing. It was enormous. After class, he walked through the corridor toward the east stairwell, old habit, safety route, and stopped at the window that looked out over the side yard. The ivy wall was visible from here. The bench in the garden was empty. He stood there for a moment. He thought about the classroom floor, the sound the scissors made, the curl he had picked up and held under the desk where no one could see. He had thrown it away eventually, not because it stopped mattering, but because carrying it felt like carrying the weight of a room that didn't deserve any more of his energy. He thought about Nyla's hands around his. He thought about a man who knelt to eye level when he didn't have to. He thought about 7 homes and a packed bag and a zipper closed by 2 small deliberate hands. He thought about the word okay, written on a page in a garden at the end of a long, exhausting, world-rearranging day. He looked at his reflection in the window for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward his next class. The hair was still uneven, probably always would be. He had decided he liked it that way. Tomorrow would be harder. That was still true. Zion had said it and meant it, and Ezra believed it. But for the first time in a life that had moved him through rooms that never quite belonged to him, he wasn't alone. If the story moved something in you, if you have ever felt invisible in a room full of people, if you have ever had someone choose you when the world said you weren't worth the cost, drop a comment right now. Tell someone what it felt like. Because stories like this one don't end on screen. They continue in the people who watch them. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell. Every week we bring you stories that don't get told loudly enough. Stories about people who were overlooked, underestimated, and still found their way through. You will not want to miss what comes next. And if this one stayed with you, share it. One person watching might need it more than you know.